Okay, so today we're going to catch up a little bit about COP26. There's a couple of months since it happened, New Year. First up, I'd just be interested in your sort of high-level thoughts as to, clearly different people had different views of what it was or wasn't going to achieve anyway, but overall, were you pleased with the progress that was made, or do you think it was a bit of a missed opportunity? Where do you stand on it?
It's difficult to call it a missed opportunity, I think. I mean, the guy who was in charge of it was crying, wasn't he? Or nearly crying when he presented the findings. That kind of tells you a lot of what you need to know. The flip side of that, it was a global initiative, and it was always going to be hard. I think the big benefit, being optimistic, is that people are talking about it now, and they will be continuing to talk about it. The actual decisions that were made didn't seem to be particularly groundbreaking, and there were a lot of sort of equivocation that took place on what it actually meant for different countries, and whether it was scaled back or watered down as to be not very useful. But the big benefit of it is that from a PR point of view, at least, it seems to have captured the imaginations of lots of businesses. When you're looking at behavioural change or systemic change, it's not just the governments that do that. The government really crude tools in carrots and sticks, as you've alluded to in the past. But it has to be people that make the changes. And when you have people like the Science Based Initiative saying, give us time to rework our advice for SMEs, and you've got other organisations saying, give us time to assess the application details on net zero pledges, that shows you that there's been a huge interest and a huge move towards that area, which can only be a good thing, I guess. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I'm interested. Do you think it will carry on then being a sort of an evolution? Obviously, there are some reasonably tight deadlines out there. 2030, quite a significant one for the data center industry, I think. But do you think it will we notice a sudden, will there be a sudden bang on a certain date and everyone will go, this is it, this is what we're doing? Or will it continue to be more or less what it is, that it'll be a gradual process that we may not notice until we suddenly realise, adding all these little changes up, that things have changed quite a lot?
I think that depends on us. I think that depends on the people in each sector and how proactive they decide to be, how many conversations they have and how much will there is to change. I think it will depend on sectors. The finance industry seems to be way ahead of all this. The banking sector seems to be way ahead of all this, presumably because their risk horizons are a bit longer than other sectors maybe, and they're all about managing risk. They're all about seeing that climate is a real issue to the way that we do business at the moment, as are material shortages and other environmental risks, and they're very well aware of that. I think in other sectors, we kind of have to wake up to that maybe. I know the people I talk to in the sector are incredibly proactive on this and do care, and pushing the sector to go farther than it has done in the past. That's kind of a self-limiting group, isn't it? But it depends on us, depends on how much we want to take it seriously and how much we want to do, how many conversations we have, and how much we're willing to work together, I think, is the top level answer to that.
Yeah, and in terms of perhaps drilling down a little bit and maybe to the point you've made, I mean, scope 3 is I guess the big issue. The obvious ones are 1 and 2, where everyone can pretty easily get a handle on what energy they're using, what their impact is if they can reduce it, the sort of whole supply chain thing. And I'm just wondering that the sort of e-waste, I don't think e-waste made it to the agenda. So just wondering whether that was a missed opportunity, or what do you think needs to happen around that?
Potentially it is a massive missed opportunity, because we know that the embodied carbon in ICT is huge. Like a very conservative estimate, you're looking at a ton of CO2 equivalent in a server, in the manufacture of a server. And the understanding is that those figures are massively underestimated, but we don't have any third-party information that can corroborate that at the moment. Dell has its own set of carbon footprints, which is putting the embodied CO2 of their servers a lot higher anything between 1,200 kilograms and 1,750, I think, on average, depending on the type of server. But their variance is pretty much the entire carbon footprint. So that shows you how much confidence there is in it. So I think it is a massive missed opportunity. I think when people start thinking about e-waste in the public domain, it's still associated with physical waste. And people don't necessarily understand the connection with carbon, and they don't understand the connection with climate risk. People, when they talk about e-waste, and this is the government, they're still talking about curbside collection as a response to e-waste. They're not talking about product life extension, which would reduce the amount of e-waste that we have in the first place. And they're not talking about developing technologies to recycle that e-waste and to use those recycled materials in the supply chain. So I think public understanding of e-waste is quite crude. So it is a missed opportunity, but it's not that much of a surprising one, I guess, given what we understand of various pieces of legislation going through. There doesn't seem to be a lot of joined up thinking. People make pronouncements on circular economy, they make pronouncements on electronic waste, they make pronouncements on carbon, and there's no real conglomeration of all those issues and mapping out how they all affect each other. For our sector, I think that's quite hopeful. We do have conversations in this sector on what that means. And we do have conversations about how that should be integrated into a sustainability policy. It's in its early stages compared to energy efficiency, but at least people are aware of that and industry bodies are aware of that, and collections of data centers are aware of that. So, you know, I think, yeah, missed opportunity for COP, not surprising. I think, you know, that's one benefit for the sector, is that it's in a position to do a lot better, and also potentially publicise that and then help the carbon conversation in more ways than just saying, oh, we're going to address our PUE, which is quite a crude way of doing it.
And did the pandemic, because I had conversations, I think, with possibly with yourselves and one or two other organisations, the pandemic, when everyone was sort of scrabbling around to get IT kit that they could supply their people working from home, I think sort of reusing IT kit was one of the ways, you know, because the laptops were in such short supply, that people sort of opened their minds more to this sort of idea of recycling. Do you think that is a sustainable, but you know, is that a sustainable momentum, that shift that people began to use?
It has to be. Yeah, I can't see that it isn't. For one thing, we've still got an 18-month lead time on new equipment. Yeah, so you can't exactly just re-provision data centers with servers necessary on the drop of a hat. People are familiar with that on, you know, provisioning people to go home. If you've got a more dynamic system where things are getting built, refreshed, optimized, and your supply chain has issues, you're going to make the connection between what happened in the pandemic and what's happening now. I think the other thing is that what happened in the pandemic was a taster of much larger supply issues that are going to happen long term. So what happened in the pandemic was the immediate supply chain shut down, and that affected our cars, various other bits of production lines. People noticed, but these issues are not going away. They're going to get worse. And so now people have had a taster of that and thought about ways of handling that in the short term. That puts them potentially in a better position for handling that long term.
Okay, and then just moving on to the Green Grids initiative, I'm interested in your thoughts as to what impact that'll have on you know, particularly, I guess, the data centre sector.
Well, as I understand it, the Green Grids initiative is going to rely on information being sent from different providers and balancing the electricity grid, and that all requires data, right? So there has to be a link between the initiative itself and what will happen to the data center sector. I don't understand enough about the software to see how that would happen, but you're thinking potentially short-term adjustments across quite a short space. That's how the renewable grid has to operate, right? It needs to balance the grid. That's a lot of information being sent and received, so potentially edge. And then you've got the larger scale data transfer and how we handle that. It seems like a huge undertaking, a hugely ambitious undertaking, and something that has been announced with potentially not a lot of understanding of how it's actually going to work. And I think people in this sector are the ones that are dealt, the exciting opportunity to figure that out on behalf of the policymakers and the legislators. I'd love to hear what people much more knowledgeable than me in the sector have to say about that.
I mean, from your sort of understanding, do you think the industry is receptive? Because I mean, again, people better versed than myself know, but as I understand it, we're creeping towards the sort of demand management debate, which is obviously, we could talk about that for ages, but is the industry sort of ready, do you think, to get involved in this whole sort of energy regulation, resourcing, measuring and making sure that no one's going to run out of the, so i.e. it's going to step up and help enhance, the nation's power resources, or are people still nervous of the idea of data centers potentially exposing themselves by helping out other sectors and private individuals?
I think it's a debate that the sector is going to be at the centre of whatever happens. I think people outside of the sector recognising that digital is taking an increasing percentage of the world's energy resources because of our increased use of digital. They don't necessarily understand what that means. They don't necessarily understand the proportion of that comes from the networks, or the proportion of that comes from their own decisions on data usage. I don't think anybody could accurately give you percentages of what comes out of healthcare, what comes out of financial transactions, what comes out of Heyday, what comes out of Teams meetings. No one can give you the accurate readings on that. And so my feeling is what's going to happen is that the data center sector is going to have a focus on it because of the name of the sector, data center sector. And people are going to look to the sector for the answers to this, and also potentially ask a lot of difficult questions, fair and unfair difficult questions that the sector is going to have to sit down, figure out and come up with some answers to. And those sensible answers might be, we can manage this part of it. If you're looking to reduce this, we actually need to look at this. And we need to, the sector will not be able to help, in my opinion, being in a position of educator to this. You're going to have to be drawn into the debate of what's going on. And when you're looking at large scale innovations that require a huge amount of digital to make them work, then again, the digital sector is going to have to get involved with that, and data centers are going to be part of that. So may as well wade into the conversation early doors and start having sensible conversations to try and figure this out. So yeah, I don't think the sector's got much choice. It's got a choice and how it approaches those kinds of questions and debates.
But do you think there's an opportunity there for it to sort of grab the leadership role rather than sort of be reactive and get a shoeing? Because, as we all know, the figures is that 1% of global energy is consumed in data centers, and that's increasing, every day as new data centers open. So that's the bad news. But the good news is, as you've alluded to, there's plenty of great digital technologies that are potentially saving huge amounts of, carbon usage, etc. So it has a chance to shape that conversation as opposed to just wait until
I think it absolutely not only has a chance, but also is the best group of experts to do that. I think the answers have to come from this sector because people in this sector understand it in a way that other people don't. And recognizing that it's an opportunity, I guess. People talk about the fourth industrial revolution. People talk about data being the new oil. Like it or not, it is what runs our systems nowadays. and who understands that better than the people who work at, you know, the front end of all that. So
yeah, that's interesting, because you say data is the new oil, which I know everyone talks about, but that's an interesting comparison, isn't it? Because obviously oil is not very welcome these days. So, you know, by using that, I guess data, as you say, is potentially, you know, an unwelcome issue these days, but clearly it has a, you know, a lot of pluses as well. So it's trying to balance that out.
Absolutely. And yeah, and there has to, I see a lot of parallels between data and oil. I mean, for one thing, people had a problem with the way that the drilling industry worked and asked a series of difficult questions with good reason. Had problems with the pollution that it caused at sea level, at air level, had problems with the social issues around drilling in certain sectors, ethical issues about drilling in certain sectors. And yet we all relied on oil to deliver our goods and services for years. Even if you don't drive, you're still reliant on oil to bring the goods and equipment over from overseas. You're still reliant on oil to run the factories. I think that there's a strong parallel there with data. You know, people might not understand the production of data or the management of data or the machines or industries that manage that. They don't understand that. They do see it as a problem and that it has these risks associated with it. But they also derive loads of benefits from it. You know, our banking system doesn't work without data. Our education system doesn't work without data. Transport system does not work without data. Any kind of innovation that we're proposing to reduce carbon does not work without data. So as citizens, we're users of that resource. And then we are angry about the way, or concerned about the way that that's being produced. So I guess the answer is for the sector to educate people of how that is produced, what that does mean, what the energy cost is, what decisions people can make as consumers to reduce those impacts, because society can make choices too, and then be open to the difficult questions that are going to come and try and be responsive to the concerns that people have. Which is part of that educating those who have the questions on what that actually means, because they're going to get it wrong because they don't understand it. And part of it is about challenging ourselves to say, okay, yeah, maybe we could do better on that. Maybe that's right. Maybe we should look at that. Maybe, you know, maybe that's really difficult. So let's look at how much benefit we would reap from doing it this way versus how much effort and energy and time and resources are spent getting there. So, I mean, conversations in Germany revolve around smart meters, for example. You know, we're talking about smart meters for energy usage that give you real-time information on, you know, what switching on the kettle did to your energy bill over that period. And people are saying, well, hold on, wait a minute. The energy that takes to measure and transfer to be aggregated and calculated and then come back to the device, maybe that was more than switching on the kettle in the first place. Now, only people who understand data and energy and the crossover between it can make those kinds of analysis. So I think it's a huge opportunity for people here who do to have a look at that.
Yeah, and another area which is potentially as complicated but interesting is the urban transitions mission. So can you perhaps give us a little overview of what that is and what impact you think it may have over time?
So this is this whole smart cities initiative, is it? Yeah, again, it's you know, integrated systems of systems and everything being accessible within walking space, and how you manage all that, and how you measure, reduce the energy on that. Again, like that seems to be an issue that needs digitalisation to make work. So people might think that it's sort of like this return to the 1930s before we all had cars, but actually there's a huge digital cost to that, and more infrastructure around that to make it work.
I mean, obviously, but during the pandemic, a lot of people ran away from the cities for understandable reasons. So there's that sort of slightly contrary scenario. But also, I'm just wondering, there's a lot of upheaval that may have to go into establishing those. You know, if we are going to eventually castigate, you know, if you're going to live in the countryside, then it's going to cost you, you know, even more than it potentially does now. You know, there's a whole social thing. I'm just interested as to how you see, is it government levels, I guess, that have to dictate whether we like it or not, you know, what's the acceptable way for private citizens and businesses to run themselves, or do you think it will sort of naturally evolve in ways that we're all comfortable with, or will there be a sort of jarring at some stage?
Yeah, dystopian futures, you mean?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, you know, we've all seen the movies and stuff, but if we're all, I know, you know, from previous careers that sort of mega cities and all that stuff makes a lot of sense in many ways, but they're clearly down. So I'm just intrigued as to your thoughts on, you know, whether that's
I do think
desirable and or, you know, will happen. But
I do think about this quite a lot because of conversations that I have with people in the sector, and also because where I live. So I live in North Yorkshire, just outside of a relatively small town, which is a farming country. And in rural areas, they were the last to get electricity. They were the last to get running water. You know, the sewage system still hasn't come out here yet. So when we hear about transitions towards renewable powers and renewable grids, you're wondering how that's going to work in rural areas. What is that going to look like? Especially considering we know of resources to deliver on a renewable grid in the very first place. So I am not an energy expert, but I do talk to people who are, and their back of a fag packet calculation is that we don't have, if we transitioned all our energy supply now onto solar, it wouldn't fit. Because if you look at the projections of how much renewables is expected to generate over a period of time, it doesn't match the current energy usage of the UK. So that's one thing. Knowing what we do with materials, we also know that there's going to be huge pressure on the materials required to develop the infrastructure. So other people have highlighted this in the past, you know, I think copper's doubled in price over the past year, lithium 70% increase, then you've got the space constraints and everything. And then in amongst all this, there are these top level plans to transition all of our transport as well onto a renewable grid. So we don't have a renewable grid that's large enough already to cope with all the electricity that we're using in the first place. Now we're saying, okay, gas boilers are outlawed, so all of that goes to electricity, and then all the transport goes to electricity. The maths doesn't really add up. You know, there is no way of making all this usage fit onto this resource platform that's been calculated. It just doesn't, it just overflows and spills all over the place. So it will be interesting to see what that looks like. You know, it will be interesting to see what the solution is to this. My sense is that governments haven't really thought about it, or if they thought about it, they've not articulated those thoughts in a planned way. They've just said, okay, we're going to build back better and we're going to have some more renewable jobs. They haven't addressed this mathematical problem that people in this sector, let alone any other, can see at a glance that this is an issue. I suppose part of that is because we're going to have to reduce what we're doing, I guess. That seems the only sensible answer. mean, even if we went to nuclear, which has been proposed as an alternative solution, it's going to take years to develop that nuclear capacity, even if we're cool with that. So I can't see that it's anything other than we're going to have to change the way that we do things. And it would be, it's interesting to see what that looks like, and, budgeting our lives, I guess. I mean, one of the benefits of the pandemic is like people haven't been able to travel as much. So we've got used to not flying as much, which cuts down on our carbon usage. But we've been comforting ourselves with online shopping. So probably van usage has expanded at the same time. So
yeah, I mean, do you think, and I don't know for completely understandable reasons, but do you think governments sort of all over the world are rather terrified of spelling out, if we are serious about net zero, that it will have this, whether it's smart cities or, as you say, just cutting down on consumption? Because, as you say, even the renewable side of things, and I think we've chatted before, building a wind turbine, there's a lot of raw materials that you're never going to get back used, presumably the same in solar panels. So we can't just carry on consuming at the levels we're consuming. So therefore there will have to be some, impact restrictions on lives. And I say governments don't really like the idea of telling us, you can only go on one holiday a year as opposed to, limitless or whatever, but is that not what's required at some stage?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I agree to some extent that the politicians are nervous about saying that. Another view on that is that they don't need to, because their terms are like 4 years. I mean, it's longer than that in some cases. It can be like 12 to 15 years for some governments, but we're still looking at like larger timeframes than that. So by not articulating this and not making difficult decisions, they don't have to face the consequences of that, because their tenure is shorter than the problem that we have. People, our tenure is hopefully longer than the time frame that we have to make changes. So I don't know, I guess it's naive to look to government to make these decisions for us. It's our society and it's our planet, and we're going to have to deal with the consequences. And if you are in a sector or in a job that has the ability to make some kind of impact, then that's something that is worth doing. If you're looking at energy usage and you're saying, for our sector, you're saying, okay, the trend is that more and more of our energy usage is transferred onto digital. Digital is growing, but it's also absorbing the energy cost of other sectors because it's taking over their roles. So there's that, but in amongst all this, if we can make the energy usage of this sector as efficient as possible, then there's a net positive towards that, which might, help us with some of the problems that we've got. And that, I mean, it's not just energy efficiency within the building, which the data center sector understands quite well. It's things like backups, things like how many machines you need to run a certain system. Are we prepared to wait a little bit longer for that data to ping around the world? Can we do that? Can we encourage people to use data in a different way? Again, they're really hard questions and they're really hard issues, and we shouldn't shy away from that. Telling people that it's perhaps a bit frivolous to take so many pictures on their mobile phones. That's a bit of a nanny state attitude. So it's uncomfortable, but perhaps if we can articulate that in the right ways and demonstrate that, okay, if you do this will be the net effect, we might be able to do something about it. And also try and make the systems that we build as energy efficient as possible. Because as I understand it, when people make new pieces of software they don't necessarily understand or look into the energy cost of what they're doing if it's rolled out over multiple users, because they've not thought about it, well, maybe it's time to think about it, and maybe it's time for, you know, people who run the networks and the systems and the buildings that manage this to, you know, come together in the same room and see if they can help.
And do you think the industry, you know, just on the renewables, do you think the industry again needs to have a think? Because I mean, traditionally, data centers are built relatively close to where they think all the users are going to be, and okay, then information, as you say, data whizzes around the world. But fundamentally, people using a data center seem to like to think that it's, you know, somewhere that they can get to fairly quickly for whatever reason. But if we're talking renewables or certain parts of the world that have, you know, large supplies of these things, you know, and the climate's quite good to minimize cooling, do you think the industry will almost end up with a two-tier? So critical data centers for like the finance sector, where, you know, a millisecond or whatever it is matters for trading purposes, they'll always need data centers you know, somewhere very close by. But for the vast majority of us, if, you know, they're in data centers in the Antarctic, the Arctic, or, you know, that's maybe extreme, but, you know, climates that don't require much energy to cool them, etc. Do you think that's a likely trend over time, or because there's companies making money out of building data centers, you know, they'll decide where to build it? Thought.
I mean, I think it's probably something that the sector should look into and try and understand. I mean, there are a few issues there. One is I don't understand how much energy is lost on long haul cabling, but it's some, right? So if you have these huge megaliths up in the Arctic because, you know, we've got cheap cooling there, what's the balance of not cooling that data center versus all the energy lost through the wire down to wherever it's needed? So I guess that's one thing. And then another thing is that when people talk about driverless cars and machine learning, you're talking about instantaneous short pieces of communication in order to train the machine in how to do something, or let the car know what's upcoming. But then you don't need to store the information in the same way, but it's that kind of pinging. Depending on how the system organizes itself, it could be that we need much more of those short-term pings, in which case we don't need these massive megaliths that are storing these huge amounts of data. Maybe we need, you know, edge along the motorway is the, you know, classic example, isn't it? Stick it along the motorway, and then it can do all this talking to each other while the driverless cars are going along and setting their own maps and everything. I mean, again, that's kind of, it's debatable whether that's going to work, given the fact that we all tend to use cars at the same time, and I don't know how that whole sharing car thing is going to work. But anyway, in abstract, there's that. And if that happened, I guess all the lessons that we've learned on how to make large data centers energy and materials efficient have to be relearnt for a different set of priorities. You know, all the, you know, house it in one massive building, optimize the cooling, optimize your design, optimize your refreshes, you know, have, if you're a huge operator, have some algorithms that calculate all that for you, have the software optimized over the machines, blah, 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 blah. Then that all has to be relearned in another environment, doesn't it? So I don't know. And I don't know how, I think it's something that we're going to have to look at, and we're going to have to, again, have lots of conversations on what do we need this new data to do, and what is the best way of delivering on that. And if we're going to go to a different model, how do we optimize that new model to make it as efficient as possible for resources and energy?
Okay, I've asked a lot about those sort of, I suppose I'd not call you social issues, but yeah, the wider issues. But maybe going back to a bit more specifics, there's something now, I think the International Sustainability Standards Board. I'm just wondering, what do you think the impact of that will be? You know, we're talking about data centers, obviously, on that data center sector in terms of, you know, what they will be obliged to to do report, based around this standards board?
Well, it was an announcement at COP26, wasn't it? And like so many other things that came out of COP26, it was just an announcement. So it's like, this is a good idea. We all agree it's a good idea. Silence. So we don't actually know what's in there until it happens. There are a number of sustainability frameworks that are available to different sectors in different ways. So there's the Global Reporting Initiative is a big one. There's the Global Goals framework, which is basically positive news and things that we can do to help. And then there are a number of others. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of coalescence of all those frameworks. So looking at sustainability frameworks, you look what that is out there, you look at what you can do, and you kind of cherry pick the ones that are applicable to your sector or your industry. And sometimes that's a bit of a risk if you're working inside a company. So a good example is net zero pledges, which are going to come to the fore, obviously after COP26. We all know lots of people know, the nuts and bolts of this. A net zero pledge is different to a carbon negative pledge or a carbon neutral pledge, in that net zero means something very specific. It means that you reduce your scope 1 and 2 emissions as close as possible to zero. Then you look at your supply chain, you reduce those as close as possible to zero, and you optimize the rest, which they are hoping will be about 10% of your energy usage. So you offset the rest by buying stakes in renewable energy providers or carbon capture or carbon sink programs. It's a set bunch of stuff that you're supposed to do that everybody agrees to. And that means something very effective. But when you are a business that has under 500 employees, setting a net zero pledge is next to impossible, because the science-based targets don't apply yet in the same way to companies under 500 employees. And we're waiting for information on how smaller companies are supposed to do this without the resources to check their entire supply chain. So that's a bit of a long-winded technical / boring explanation, but it kind of shows where you are. You're in quite a new sector where there are a lot of different frameworks for reporting, some of which fit and some of which don't. And as a business, you're trying to say, okay, well, which one do we go for now when everything's in flux? And so I guess the benefit of something like this is it would hopefully stop it being in flux and say, when you make an announcement and you do it against this framework, it's a set of globally agreed recommendations or targets. So I can make this claim as an SME with a headquarters in the UK, and somebody in Australia who has a large company will understand that language and be comparable. And that's precisely where we are not at the moment. And that's precisely why companies are coming under criticism for greenwashing. Some of it is fair enough. Some of it is because they are just initiating PR activities. And some of it is because we're still trying to figure out how to measure stuff and how to talk about stuff in the same way that everybody else does. So some of it's accidental. So when we've got a common language, we can start to address that. But we won't know for a couple of years what that actually looks like and how you can apply it in a practical sense.
Yeah, and I mean, you say that's part of the problem. You say obviously a couple of years, however long it takes. We haven't got that much time, have we, to allow for these things to develop. And you made up very interesting. I can't remember. It was one of the big IT companies, I think, a while back, did a set of it may have been one of the big hyperscalers. It did a set of calculations. They sort of analysed, I guess, the life cycle of certain activities and tried to measure every bit of it as to plus or minus, I guess, environmental impact. And we kind of need the world's biggest, I don't know whether you call it a dictionary or whatever it is, so that virtually every activity that companies or individuals undertake, you can work out as easily as possible whether it's having a positive or negative effect on the environment. I mean, is that anywhere near achievable in any kind of reasonable time frame?
A global initiative that everybody speaks the same language, it seems like exceedingly difficult. Yeah. Yes, exceedingly difficult given the time frame that we have. So I guess two things are doable within the time frame. One is that we accept like a workable, not perfect option, like we did with PUE in this sector. It's got its problems. Everybody knows it's got its problems, but at least it's something that we can start talking about, start measuring and start discussing. And then there are a load of other that are coming out now, a load of other KPIs that are similar. So kind of like a workable solution is one thing. The other thing is that I think that people are very well aware in their own businesses of sensible decisions that they could make. They may not be measurable, but there are easy wins that you can make in an organization. You just need to look at what you're doing and think about it. You know, just like look at your waste streams. What are you sending out there? You know, what's the biggest waste stream? Start there. What is the biggest thing that I'm throwing in the bin that doesn't need to be thrown in the bin? And what's the biggest impact waste stream? So, you know, if I throw a load of bananas in the garden, it's not great, but I don't really care because they're going to rot down. Versus if I throw out 3 servers and bury them in my back garden, that's a problem. Or if I throw a load of sulfuric acid over them first to melt them down and then bury them in the back, that's a massive problem. So it's about, I guess, assessing impact and risk in your own organization and trying to analyze that and figure out what the best choices are. And one of the things that I do like about the carbon accounting things, they've got scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So scope 1 is something you directly do. Scope 2 is something you are directly responsible with your purchase choices. And then scope 3 are some other choices that are further removed from you. I think you can make good sustainability choices by applying the same thinking. What's in my scope 2? Who are my contractors? What do they do? What do I pay for? You know, what are my waste streams? And you can probably do that, you know, make some good decisions quite early, you know, whether they're quantifiable and right compared to anything else is another question. And that, I guess, only gets an answer when people come together and trying to assess it. You know, if a company produces a large amount of software which is used around the globe and is not energy efficient and backs up to 3 or 4 places on various different clouds, as an example, and they reduce the amount of servers that they use, which is the biggest win. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I think it's hard conversations and educating ourselves and having a go.
Yeah.
Nice scientific thing to say.
Yeah, no, as you say, that's the important. Also, I mean, you talked about educating ourselves, and clearly the younger generation is, we're led to believe that they are much more in tune with this kind of debate, but they still potentially do need some education. So, in the UK, at least, I'm interested. I think the Department of Education has put sort of sustainability, environmental issues more, I won't say front and center, but they've introduced more initiatives. Do you think that is, I imagine you think it's helpful, but again, in the time frame we're talking, are these the current school generation, how much does it matter that they get this education as to when they hit the sort of the adult world of work and I guess leisure as well?
Yeah, I don't think it's just the adult world of work. I think it's behavior, isn't it? It's attitudes. I think, yeah, in abstract, it's a good thing for people to do. Again, I think it's something that our sector can be of real value, contributing to this. I think that this sector understands, I keep going on about it, how much data costs, not data centers, data, how much it costs us. You know, what choices you can make in terms of which network you use. And by that, I mean a mobile phone network versus a wireless network. You know, what decisions you can make on deleting photos, for example, rather than, you know, sending them to your family WhatsApp and posting on Facebook and then allowing all the clouds to back that up. Just, we might not be able to give an absolutely accurate figure, but this sector is able to tell people what happens when you make those button choices that are instantaneous on your devices, what the knock-on effect of that is. And I think that if we could put together training programs for, you know, really young kids, just explaining that. At a very simple level, I've always wanted to go into a school and lift up a server for teenagers and say, you know, the internet, you know, Snapchat, this is what it runs on. That's not necessarily a sustainability message. It's just, you know, this is the stuff that runs, you know, what you live your lives on. I think making those connections for young people is really useful, because then when they get older and they say, okay, well, you know, maybe we should reduce our energy usage by the use of data, they have some understanding of where that came from a really young age. And it doesn't have to be waggly finger, it can just be fun information.
Yeah, I'm intrigued because during the pandemic, the sort of IT industry was held up as the sort of fourth emergency service, I think it was, you know, that it kept everything running. So do you think there's an opportunity sort of following on from that, or have we already lost it? That they, it strikes me, whether it's been, you know, you see on the telly these adverts for the Navy, the Army, and how, you know, all the marvelous things they do. As the data engineer, you almost need to be front and center and actually point out to people that virtually every activity that any of us, you know, undertake in our private or work lives, there's a data center somewhere in the background. So it's like, you know, kick them for using vast amounts of energy, but by the way, if we weren't around, then life would be somewhat plain.
And also,
and
you know, like a similar kind of messaging, you know, we need creative young people who are aware of all the issues to come into this sector and help run it, because it's part, like it or not, it's a central part of society. So don't leave it to somebody who is just interested in one particular area to go off and work in that sector. Let's have everybody, and let's have everybody's thoughts and ideas. You know, I think that's a useful message to put on the TV. You know, this is what runs our society. Come and be part of it. Come and help make the right decisions. You know, I don't know. I guess as a parent, I'm constantly aware that I've just left my kids with a bit of a mess, and I kind of want to say sorry, but I also want to say, well, you know, you're creative people and you've got the chance to do something better than your parents did. And I think that this sector can do the same thing. You know, this was created in our lifetime. Now you make it work. You know, make it work in the best way that you can, because you've been brought up with this and you're the people that can do it.
So I guess well, we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm very grateful for your patience with me, so thank you for that. But in concluding, do you think the data center industry, I mean, did COP26 provide any shocks to the data center industry, or just some signposts, some indications as to where the industry perhaps needs to be, although we both know that it's already doing quite a lot, but as COP26 required them, or at least given them the kick to ramp up the speed at which things are being done, or is it pretty much business as usual because the industry is already on a sort of roadmap towards sustainability?
I think what's come out of COP26, as I understand it, is pretty much business as usual. They seem to ignore data as a, you know, something that needed controlling or legislating against. I mean, there are pieces of legislation that are upcoming. So the SECR, Streamline Energy and Carbon Reporting, anybody in the industry is going to have to do that in their company reports. And then there's TCFD, which is companies over 500 million turnover, going to have to report their climate risks and opportunities. So there are things that are happening in the background, but they're not associated with COP. I think COP presents a good opportunity in some ways because it's kind of pushing towards digital as a solution. As you know, that's what the top level narrative kind of does. That's what the global goals do as well. So it's an opportunity for the industry to be really proactive and say, yeah, brilliant. Yeah, this is the way things are going. We can deliver on all this, but we want to deliver on it in the best way that we possibly can, so that we don't face problems as a global community and also as a sector in 20 years' time, when people sit around and say, wait a minute, why do you do it like that?
Yeah, so I suppose, I mean, you mentioned the carrot and stick. Do you think the government, as you say, they come and go, and potentially don't have the, not just for the data center industry, but other industry sectors maybe don't have the knowledge and the expertise. So do you think it is largely up to the industry to, within certain legislative sort of boundaries, carry out this work itself, or do you think there will be, whether it's globally in a future COP or whatever, or do you think the industry itself will be left to find the way towards those sort of net zero objectives?
I think that there will be net zero objectives imposed upon the sector, but I don't think they're going to come out of COP. I think they're just going to be coming out of carbon accounting and the fact that that's an increasingly core part of business. I think that the sector, I keep saying this, should be taking the lead on this and articulating what that actually means at all levels and trying to map that out and understand it. The work that the SDIA is doing in Europe is really key on this, because they're trying to find out the carbon footprint of hardware in order to deliver some kind of information on the carbon footprint of software. And when we do that, we can have some kind of simple, reasonable conversation on what we're saving with this software versus what it costs us. We can have a balance sheet and we can start having good conversations around that. I think the SDIA is a really good example, because there are people inside the sector who are doing this because they can. And I think that's probably something that the whole sector has to do. The people in this industry are the ones with the answers, and they need to really look at it and have some conversations and come up with some sensible answers before bad things happen. in terms of mistakes that are made with increasing digitalisation, where we've made some fundamental mistakes at the beginning, potentially, that affect us for years afterwards. We don't want to pull all this apart and start again, do we? We want to get it as right as we can the first time. And the other side of it is that data centres are going to come under threat for other reasons as well, not just environmental. So, we've got large organisations coming under huge criticism for their attitude on competition, tax evasion, being outside of national governmental laws. These are all things that are going to be associated with global digital organisations, and you can see it already. So doing the right thing in the environmental arena will serve people well when they come under criticism in other areas as well.
Okay, well, as I say, you've been very, very kind, very patient with me, and we've covered a lot of ground, and really appreciate you giving some expert thoughts. So Astrid, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.